Dear friends, we are gathered today to commemorate one of the saddest days in the history of European Jews, the tragedy of Babi Yar in Kiev. It was one of the biggest sores on the body of Europe during the Second World War. We know much about the concentration camps that were operating all over Europe, but few know about the places where mass exterminations of Jews took place in the former Soviet Union. One of these places was suburb of Kiev, where immediately after the start of the war, more than 200,000 Jews were killed. There were women, children, and elderly on whom bullets were considered a waste, so they were pushed inside deep pits as more and more bodies were dropped on top of them. These atrocities were committed by local collaborators, Ukrainian authorities. Numerous local witnesses told authorities after the war that they saw the earth moved after innocent were executed and the pits were filled in, meaning many were buried alive under corpse and dirt. This place became one of the biggest cities of mass extermination of Soviet Jews. In the 1990s, a monument was established to remember these atrocities at the Montefiore Cemetery in Philadelphia. This was one of the first monuments that was dedicated to this tragedy. Since then, every year of the end of September, we gather on the cemetery to remember those who perished and to say some words in their memory. I have conducted these gatherings for many years, and Mr. Don Wittenberg is always present. He addressed those who gathered, and I translate his statements. Today I address you, United States Jews, who have done much to facilitate the arrival of Soviet Jews in the United States. And we are very grateful to you for this support. 1/3 of Jews in the world was exterminated by the German Nazis, and this is why we remember this tragedy so often, and our heart ache for the loss. A few years after construction of the first monument at Montefiore, a second memorial was erected at the Shalom Memorial Park in Philadelphia. The late Dr. Friedman and Joseph Vinokur, the chief editor of the Russian language newspaper Mir, which means peace, and Dmitry Gonopolsky, who created the Russian language radio program Pulse, participated in the funding, construction, and creation of this monument. And we cannot forget these individuals who have contributed so much to this project. We remember those who perished and the atrocity of Babi Yar, because our slogan is never forget, never forgive. The Spanish philosopher George Santayana once said that those who forget their past are doomed to repeat it. And those words were echoed by Winston Churchill and also written on the Holocaust monument in Baltimore. Let us now observe a moment of silence in memory of those who perished.
On June 8, 1944, Peter Katsovsky, a soldier in the Red Army, received a letter from his nephew, Abram Solotsky, revealing the fate of their family in Kiev, Ukraine, during the Nazi occupation. Abram wrote, "Peter, you were asking me about the fate of our close ones. Unfortunately, it was really bad. When I stopped in Kiev in November, our neighbor, Mrs. Rodzitsky, told me about their tragic and agonizing death. They all were in our apartment while Lyova, Hanna, and Fima were at their house. During the first days of occupation, Lyova and Hanna were shot by monsters. Then Fima came to stay in our apartment. 3 months later, Gestapo came and started to take everybody away. Then Berta told Mrs. Rodzitsky that Beba knows where the money is, and if they were to be killed, Mrs. Rodzitsky was instructed to take the children and the money. The Nazis took everyone to Babi Yar, while Mrs. Rodzitsky followed. Everybody was shot in front of her very own eyes, even children. When I heard this, my blood boiled and my eyes were bloodshot. As many Germans as I've destroyed, there is no end to my vengeance. I will take vengeance on those monsters until there aren't any left on our sacred land. I have known about those malicious acts for 7 months. I didn't send any negative letter home, only reassuring ones. You know that my mother has a lot to worry about and she's ill. News like that can only lead to negative consequences. I wrote to you about this because you're a soldier in the Red Army, so that you would take even more vengeance on those monsters for their heinous crimes. Peter, please do not repeat any of this to my mother." 10 members of our family, adults and children, were murdered in 1941 in Kiev. This letter was written 77 years ago by my cousin and sent to my father, who was recovering from his wounds in southern parts of Soviet Union. All this time we kept this letter in our family. This is all we have left from my cousin Abrasha, who was killed just before war was ended on April 15, 1945. He was a hero.
Abraham spoke of a place called Babi Yar, where the Nazis and their collaborators massacred 33,771 Jews in less than 2 days. This is the official number of those killed on September 29th and September 30th, 1941. But the Nazis also executed tens of thousands of others at the ravine during the rest of the Nazi occupation of Kiev. These victims included Jews, Russians, Ukrainians, prisoners of war, and others. While some people have heard of Babi Yar, most people outside the academic community in the United States and in the younger generations of Europe have not. This year marks the 80th anniversary of the Babi Yar Massacre. Please join us as we shed light on this horrific event and discuss the importance of remembrance. We must give voices to those who were killed and those who survived but have passed since. Holocaust survivor Elie Wiesel once said, "Let us tell tales so as not to allow the executioner to have the last word. The last word belongs to the victim."
On September 19, 1941, the Germans invaded Kiev. When they entered the city, they were unaware that the Soviets left specially trained demolition squads with orders to destroy the city's structures and facilities. The first explosions occurred the following day, on September 20th at the Citadel, which housed the Wehrmacht artillery staff. The explosion caused the death of the commanding general and his chief of staff. Although the Soviets were responsible, the Nazis blamed the Jews. They used this event as the reasoning to execute the Jews, even though they were planning to kill the Jews regardless of the bombings. Following this event, signs appeared throughout Kiev on September 28th calling for the rounding up of Jews. These signs were printed in German, Ukrainian, and Russian, and called for the Jews to bring their possessions, money, documents, valuables, and warm clothing to a specific location. Because the assembly point was near railway freight yards, and rumors of resettlement lingered throughout the city, the Jews believed they were going to be deported. Many Jews left prior to the occupation, and most of the able-bodied men served with the Red Army. Some of the Jews remained in Kiev because they were devoutly religious, and this was around the time of the high holidays. Many of the other Jews left in Kiev.
It was early in the morning, and the sky was still dark when the Jews appeared, hoping to get good seats on the train. Thousands of Jews filled the streets. Survivor I. Minkin Igerichev described this as a sea of heads. But as Jews walked towards their assigned location, Nazi soldiers and Ukrainian militia waited for them. In front of the crowds stood barriers which prevented people from seeing into the ravine. 30 to 40 people were taken to an area for registration, where they forced Jews to deposit their documents and valuables. The ground was covered by thick layers of discarded papers, torn passports, and union identification cards. Jews were then forced to strip. Boys and girls, men and women, young and old. There were no exceptions, and the Nazis collected all their clothing. Survivor Maria Grinberg recalled they were throwing their cards, throwing their clothes. Some people were throwing their stuff because they realized they didn't need it anymore. Forced to stand at the edge of the ravine, the Nazis and Ukrainian collaborators gunned down the Jews by automatic fire. The bodies of Jews fell into the ravine. Soviet writer Vasily Grossman, author of The Black Book, described the image as all around hundreds and thousands of bodies lay piled on top of each other. The bodies of old men rested on the bodies of children who lay on the bodies of their dead mothers. Approximately 30% of those killed at Babi Yar on September the 29th to 30th were children under the age of 8 left in the care of grandparents.
Later official Nazi reports revealed that they executed more Jews than anticipated. These reports also expressed how surprised the Germans were with the fervor among many Ukrainians in their desire to collaborate in killing the Jews. Some helped in the actual killings, while others snitched to the Nazis on the whereabouts of certain Jews. There were also many cases of neighbors and people that were once friends handing over the Jews to the Nazis. While it is important to address the Ukrainian collaboration, there are also many people who helped the Jews. But the Ukrainians that worked with the Nazis outnumbered the Ukrainians that helped the Jews. In August 1943, when the Germans realized that defeat was possible, orders were received to erase all traces of what happened at Babi Yar. Bodies were dug up and searched for any valuables that had been missed during the mass shootings. Jewish prisoners were forced to construct large crematoria where the prisoners then stacked bodies alternately with logs and doused the pyres with gasoline. The bodies took 2 nights and 1 day to burn. Following the burning, machines were brought in to crush any bones that survived incineration and scattered them over the area mixed with earth. This process took approximately 6 weeks. The prisoners who escaped the event estimated that they incinerated somewhere between 100,000 and 125,000 bodies.
Before the Red Army took back Kiev, Soviet writer Anatoly Kuznetsov and a friend, who were young teenagers at the time, went along to the Babi Yar ravine to see if there was anything left behind. In previous years, Kuznetsov played in the ravine and knew the land well. He reflected on the saying, "The riverbed was of good, coarse sand, but now, for some reason or another, the sand was mixed with little white stones." Kuznetsov bent down and picked up the small white stones to see them more closely. He described them as, it was a small piece of bone about as big as a fingernail. It was charred on one side and white on the other. Kuznetsov and his friend walked more along the ravine and explained. At this point, the ravine became more narrower and split into several branches. And in one place, we saw that the sand had turned gray. Suddenly, we realized we were walking on human ashes.
The story of Babi Yar doesn't end with the destruction of evidence or the conclusion of the war. While the Nazis tried to destroy all evidence of their acts of extermination, the Soviet government, beginning with efforts by Joseph Stalin, launched a massive campaign that destroyed all evidence of Jewish suffering in World War II. The government prevented the creation of a memorial and manipulated entries in textbooks and encyclopedias. The media controlled by the government also took action to serve the government's political agenda. The official government report on the Babi Yar Massacre, published approximately 6 months after Kiev's liberation, described the Nazi crimes at Babi Yar against the Soviet citizens without mention of the Jews. After the war, there were plans created for a public monument at Babi Yar, but the government quickly scrapped those plans. In 1948, Soviet Jewish institutions were forced to close, and the government tightened their laws of censorship. From 1948 to 1953, there was a period called the Black Years of Soviet Jewry. Jews were banned from serving on the general staff of the Communist Party and in the foreign service. Stalin had a notion that Jews were disloyal to the Soviet Union because their interests lay primarily with the new state of Israel and the United States. The Soviet government accused the Jewish people of economic sabotage, treason, espionage, theft of state property, embezzlement, bribery, currency speculation, and other economic crimes.
In order to push their agenda in line with their communist views, the government had to eliminate and manipulate previous histories. Jews were removed from Russian history, and the government promoted anti-cosmopolitanism and anti-Zionism. Jews were either taken out of historical events or portrayed in the most negative and false ways in order for people to believe what the Soviet government wanted them to believe. Even years after the war, when history books discussed World War II and the Nazi invasion, there was no mention at all of the Jews. In one publication, The Madness of the Swastika, the author described Nazi leaders as being at least one-half Jewish, if not completely Jewish, and that the Jews benefited from Nazi ideology and the Nazi occupation. Some historians argue that one of the reasons for ignoring the Jewish victims of the Holocaust in the Soviet Union is because of the local collaboration of its own people. If books were to be published about the Jewish victims, then the truth would also come to light about Stalin's original pact made with Germany, as well as Stalin's psychotic episodes of his pre-war purges. Any mention of Jewish victims was considered hostile Western propaganda. In 1959, Khrushchev spoke to the world about the question on Jews in the Soviet Union. He responded, quote, "In general, the national problem does not exist in our country. The question of man's religion is not asked in our country," unquote. One of the survivors in Kiev, Viktor Dichenko, described the government treatment of Jews, quote, "Why they didn't take someone to work?" People might answer, because of question number 5, which was a question about nationality, and people knew then that it was because they were Jewish. Although Khrushchev implemented some anti-Semitic policies, there was also slight thaw displayed by the Soviet government, going back and forth with half-opening doors for the Jews. In a meeting with American Jewish war veterans in 1959, Khrushchev admitted that the Nazis murdered more than half of the Ukrainian Jews, and the Nazis mostly killed Jews at Babi Yar.
Years after Stalin's death, people began to question the lack of a memorial at Babi Yar. But even with the questioning, Soviet propaganda and censorship always prevailed. In 1957, there was a discussion of a memorial at Babi Yar, but the discussion was short-lived, since Soviet authorities decided that it was more appropriate to destroy the site altogether. The idea prevailed that building a sports stadium over the massacre site and a dam at the end of the ravine would serve the community better than a monument. In 1959, Soviet writer Viktor Nekrasov wrote a letter to a newspaper saying, "I am standing over Babi Yar, silence, a wasteland. Houses are being built on the other side of the ravine. Nekrasov, as well as many others, were completely appalled that the massacre site could be transformed into a place of fun and laughter. A few months later, the same newspaper published a letter containing signatures of numerous inhabitants of the area, who supported the recommendation to establish a monument. The government insisted that there first had to be a park before a monument, and that the inscription on the monument would identify the 1941 victims as Soviet citizens. Nikita Khrushchev ultimately vetoed the plans, and construction began for a dam. Approximately a year after work began on the dam collapsed and sent a 30-foot wall of water and mud cascading into the northern suburbs of Kiev, killing and injuring many.
In 1961, Russian poet Yevgeny Yevtushenko condemned the anti-Semitism and lack of memorial that existed throughout the Soviet Union in his infamous poem Babi Yar. Because Babi Yar had no monument to honor and remember the dead, Yevtushenko wrote, "Here all things scream silently." Yevtushenko's message rippled throughout the Soviet Union and shook the world. His poem broke the silence. Of course, Yevtushenko was attacked by the Soviet government for what they considered ignoring the facts. Following the publication of the poem, Dmitri Shostakovich wrote his 13th symphony based on Yevtushenko's words. Yevtushenko recalled, "It became the first sound monument over Babi Yar." In response to the poem and the symphony, the government decided it would be better to bulldoze the area, including the nearby old Jewish cemetery. They made plans to replace the cemetery with a television center and apartment building.
In 1966, another publication appeared devoted to Babi Yar. Anatoly Kuznetsov published Babi Yar, a document in the form of a novel. The only reason his work reached publication is because the editor of the journal in which it appeared believed that the work provided a counter-argument to Yevtushenko's poem. The book discussed the Babi Yar Massacre, but also the strong anti-Semitism that existed in the community and even his own home. The publication stirred up various types of excitement throughout the Soviet community and the government. There were many people who were offended by it, but for some it inspired them to hold ceremonies at Babi Yar. Of course, any gatherings focused on the remembrance at Babi Yar were dispersed by police, and all video footage and equipment from cameramen were confiscated. A couple of weeks later, a granite stone whose inscription called for the plans for the establishment of a memorial at Babi Yar dedicated to the memory of the victims of fascism. Any partial thawing disappeared during the Israel-Arab War of 1967. During the Six-Day War, the Soviets provided the Arabs with military equipment. The humiliating defeat ultimately resulted in a huge propaganda effort against the Zionists and Jews. During this campaign, the Soviet government often compared the Zionists to Nazis. In 1971, Pravda wrote, "The tragedy of Babi Yar will forever embody not only the cannibalism of Hitlerites, but also the indelible shame of their accomplices and followers, the Zionists." During this time, many Jews were trying to leave the Soviet Union due to persecution and were denied. This crusade against the Soviet Jews backfired. It made the world aware of the situation of the Jews in the Soviet Union. People organized petitions and demonstrations appealing to the Jews. During a time of anti-Semitic campaigns, Leonid Brezhnev allowed limited Jewish immigration from the Soviet Union because he wanted to gain access to American technology. In order to gain access, Brezhnev was forced to disguise the USSR as a country that gave all nationalities equality.
The world appeared to watch the Soviet Union and their anti-Semitic policies. During the 1950s, the Soviets established some monuments at the sites of Nazi crimes, but relentlessly fought any memorials at Babi Yar. In 1975, the New York Times explained the lack of monuments at Babi Yar as a symbol of what Jews describe as Soviet unwillingness to acknowledge that German atrocities were directed mainly at Jews. The Soviet government also didn't want to admit that their own people collaborated with the Nazis. In the USSR, there was government-sponsored anti-Semitism, but there also still existed an age-old anti-Semitism. Israel Kleiner, a Jewish immigrant from Ukraine, described the strained Ukrainian-Jewish relationship in a single expression that was heard many times by Jews in the post-Holocaust years as, "We can still arrange another Babi Yar for you." Another common sentiment at this time that seemed to represent the government's actions was, "All people in the Soviet Union suffered, so why divide the dead?"
Another partial thaw in the Soviet Union came about because of the Helsinki Accords in 1975. This agreement finalized the boundary changes in post-World War II Europe. The Accords ensured that the signatories promised to respect a list of basic human rights. Brezhnev and the Soviet Union received bombardments of criticism because they purposely failed to implement parts of the Helsinki Accords. This ultimately led to the creation of the 1976 Babi Yar monument 35 years after the initial Babi Yar tragedy. Even though the Nazis first targeted and killed the Jews at Babi Yar, the characters of the monument, as well as the inscription, revealed the suffering of Ukrainians and Soviet citizens, not the Jews. Lev Elbert, a Jew from Kiev who lived near Babi Yar, described the non-Jewish monument at Babi Yar as, quote, "There is a Ukrainian woman, a Ukrainian soldier, a sailor, a bureaucrat, a Ukrainian partisan, but none of these figures are Jews. These are non-Jewish faces." And, of course, the inscription is in Ukrainian, not in Yiddish or Hebrew, or even Russian, not a single language that the descendants of the majority of those who died here consider their mother tongue. The inscription on the 1976 monument reads, quote, "Here in 1941 to 1943, German fascist invaders executed more than 100,000 citizens of the city of Kiev and prisoners of war." In 1989, a Soviet documentary on Babi Yar argued that the Nazis attacked only the Soviet people. The film also compared Zionists to the Nazis that killed people at Babi Yar. It wasn't until the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 when the Ukrainian government allowed the creation of a separate memorial at Babi Yar dedicated to the Jewish victims. Since then, the Ukrainian government has proceeded with honoring Jewish victims at Babi Yar and attempted to educate the rest of the Ukrainian people about the atrocities in order to prevent such events from occurring again on Ukrainian soil. Former U.S. presidents have also visited the proper Babi Yar memorial.
The late Clara VINOKUR was a survivor from Shpola, Ukraine, who dedicated the second half of her life to teaching about the Holocaust. One of her major endeavors that she embarked on in Kiev was helping create a monument dedicated to those executed at Babi Yar. Even though Babi Yar was not part of her story, she made it one of her life's works to memorialize the victims of the massacre. Because some survivors and families of survivors lived in the Philadelphia area when Clara came to the United States, she helped establish a local Babi Yar memorial at Montefiore Cemetery. She brought together many people, survivors, families, and friends, while helping organize an annual remembrance ceremony at Montefiore. Clara passed away a few years ago, and we want to carry on her words as well as the accounts of the victims and survivors. We continue this tradition by sharing the story of Babi Yar with the world and hope that people learn about this tragedy and remember.
And when I came here, I organized also an organization, Memory of the Holocaust. At the beginning, we had 120 people, and now we have only 80 people because many of them passed away. So during all these 17 years I'm here, I try to do what I can to do for the memory.
The importance of remembrance is embedded in us as Jews. In a lot of ways, it stems from the events of the Holocaust and the idea that we should never forget all the persecution that we went through during the World War II times, but also other times of persecution. When we read the Parsha of Kitetse in the book of Devarim, the last lines of the Parsha are Lo Tishkach, a time that we read as well during Shabbat Zachor, the time of remembrance. We read Lo Tishkach in regards to understanding and remembering that we can never forget the times of Amalek. Similarly, with the Holocaust, we can never forget. As the child of 4 grandparents who all survived the Holocaust, it has always been embedded of me to never forget. Years ago, I had the opportunity through a very lovely organization to interview all 4 of my grandparents and really understand their stories, understand what happened to them, and the reasons why we should never forget. For me, honoring my grandparents, memorializing my grandfather, who is no longer with us, and the story that he survived at the time to create such a family, but also to honor my 3 living grandparents and their stories and how they fought when they were younger, along so many millions and millions of Jews who thankfully survived, of course not forgetting those who unfortunately perished. This is why we remember, because these times are behind us, and unfortunately, as we keep on moving forward in times, those who remember the horrific acts caused during World War II are no longer with us, but we need to remember their stories for the future so that our future generations will never forget that Jews have been fought against, but somehow, because of the miracles of God, we have survived.
To me, remembrance is how I fully experience my humanity. Sometimes remembrance hurts so deep. Sometimes it cheers me up and inspires me. Regardless, remembrance always gives me purpose, meaning, and knowledge that I need to move forward in my life. And I believe that we cannot survive and thrive as a species, as a community, as an individual without remembrance.
Holocaust remembrance to me is paying respect to all those who lost their lives and families and loved ones due to hate and simply being Jewish. I am personally affected because my grandfather escaped Poland during the Holocaust to the United States. When he got here, he worked tirelessly and endlessly to make his life and family's life better. My second cousin, Raphael Lemkin, coined the word genocide and made the killing of a group based on ethnicity illegal. Without Raphael's hard work and endless efforts, the coining and creation of the word, as well as consequences for those that commit these hateful acts, would not be present. I thank him and my family for teaching me to work hard and never give up. It is my job, amongst all those who are still alive today, to carry out their legacies and continue to do good in the world. We must continue to remember the Holocaust today and every day, because the lives lost and anti-Semitism present will never lose meaning or importance. We must remember to make sure that this never happens again and always stand up for our Jewish community, as well as any minority group that encounters hate.
My father, a German Jewish refugee who left Leipzig in the 1930s, never spoke about his experiences of Nazi Germany. From the day he arrived in England, he became English, never speaking about his mother tongue nor purchasing any German goods until the day he died. For me, someone of the second generation, who knew only what I learnt in school about the suffering of the Jews, I harboured an ever-increasing desire to learn about this past. That time came when I began to research for my novel, Daughter of the Reich, which focuses on the slow twisting of minds towards a hateful ideology. From my research and from listening with increasing concern to the anti-Semitic and racial hate being circulated so freely today on social media and in the wider world, I know that it doesn't take much to go from this to dehumanization, violence, and genocide. It's frightening, but true. So remembering the history, keeping the past alive, is key to educating and learning. We must continue to talk, to be open, to understand that we are all human, and to counter hatred with love and respect. That is why events such as the Babi Yar Memorial event are so important to me, and I am honoured to be taking part in it.
To me, the importance of remembrance is the importance of a living history. Scholars and textbooks will always be a part of understanding history, but the best historical knowledge comes from those who lived through it themselves. Without such first-hand accounts, the historical record becomes murky and liable to misinterpretation and purposeful revision. Those who remember serve as a living reminder of the mistakes of the past which should never be repeated, and stand as a bulwark against those who would seek to erase or rewrite history. Thus, it is crucial that we keep their memories alive.
Babi Yar was never something that we learned about in school, which was honestly appalling to me. This event was arguably the deadliest massacre in the entirety of the Holocaust, and my question is, why isn't it more well known? I believe that we should remember this event to not only be fully educated on a solemn history, but to mourn and pay our respects to the victims, survivors, and the families and friends of those whose lives have been forever altered by the aftermath of this event. The past is just as important as the present or the future. We remember so that we can learn, grow, or heal. By remembering Babi Yar, we learn how to empathize, to support one another, and to grieve together as a Jewish community, essentially bringing us together and create an unspoken bond between the Jewish people. That is why remembrance is important to me.
To me, remembering the Holocaust is extremely important for a couple of reasons. One being that education is an extremely important part of Jewish culture in general. It's through studying the past that we can analyze certain aspects of situations and ensure that we can combat them correctly in the future so that they don't repeat themselves. A second reason is Holocaust survivors telling their stories. I personally have benefited greatly from hearing the stories of Holocaust survivors, and I know many people across the world have. And with fewer and fewer survivors being around to tell their stories, future generations may not be as fortunate. And so it's our responsibility to carry on their stories and their legacies so that other generations have the benefit of learning and sharing them.
Saying never again is not enough. Remembrance is not simply the act of keeping the memories of the victims of Babi Yar and the Holocaust alive. Remembrance is action. Remembrance is stepping out of our comfort zones in order to protect those most vulnerable to injustice around the world. By taking action, we honor those Jewish lives lost in vain during the Holocaust.
The harsh anti-Semitism and Cold War politics are reasons for the lack of remembrance at Babi Yar. Ultimately, for 50 years, from September 29, 1941, until the fall of the Soviet Union, the tragedy remained purposely silenced and hidden from world's view. Constantly informing people about the event is already taking a step closer in making the remembrance of Babi Yar present within contemporary society. By remembering events like Babi Yar, people can better prevent similar events from occurring again. By remembering, people are taking a stand against injustice. Holocaust survivor Elie Wiesel said, "There may be times when we are powerless to prevent injustice, but there must never be a time when we fail to protest."